Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome back to the Visibility Project podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. Spearheaded by the members of the Cultural Awareness Coalition, the project is the brainchild of several organizations and individuals with shared values who sit on a project steering team. We hope that the podcast series creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world. In this episode of the Visibility Project, our focus is to break stigmas associated with domestic violence and build empathy for those who have lived through these traumatic experiences. One of our guests is a domestic violence survivor who will share her personal story. Our second guest is a professional who helps provide hope and healing to survivors. Together, they will help us better understand the deeply complex issues surrounding domestic violence. Amy Phoenix is a meditating mom of 5, committed to cultivating force-free, trustful relationships with interest in philosophy, spirituality, and slowing down enough to recognize that each moment is new. She holds a Bachelor of General Studies with double minors in Human Services and Psychology from Columbia College, with additional training in mindfulness, positive discipline, healing trauma, and energy practices to nurture well-being. Amy currently serves as the program director for YWCA Great Lakes Bay Region and feels life offers amazing opportunities to grow in the art of connecting deeply, working through challenges, and living our values. Beattie is the Prevention and Outreach Coordinator at Shelter House, a service agency in Midland, Michigan, providing refuge, hope, and healing to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Focusing on prevention programs, education, and resource sharing, Allie's work strives to build healthy communities free from these traumatic experiences. She believes that widespread culture change to combat these issues is not only possible, but attainable for future generations. Allie is a certified life educator and holds a degree in family studies from Central Michigan University. She is also the co-host of a podcast called Touchy Subjects, which focuses on bringing awareness to domestic violence and sexual assault. Before we begin our conversation, I would like to warn our listeners that this episode contains personal stories related to domestic violence that involve details that may be triggering to those who have gone through similar experiences. Well, welcome, and Allie and Amy. I'm so happy to have you here today with us, and I'm excited to learn from both of you. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to ask both of you this, and I'll ask, I guess, Allie to start, but can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
For sure. As I was introduced, my name is Allie. I am the Prevention and Outreach Coordinator at an agency called Shelter House, and I live in Michigan. I love what I do. I was very fortunate to very early on in my career find this path of education and prevention and to find my passion. Outside of work, I am a newly married wife and a dog mom to two very rambunctious Aussie mixes. And, we're just living our best life up here in the mitten. So
Awesome. Thank you, Allie. And Amy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So along with my work at the YWCA Great Lakes Bay Region doing the Women's Economic Empowerment Programming, I also facilitate mindfulness meditation. I have been doing that myself for about 13 years, just wanting to support parents with frustration, overwhelm, other stuff that can just come up in the journey of caring for little ones and bigger ones as they grow. I love to roller skate. And I am a Midland native. However, I have escaped a couple times and lived in other places. Lived in Washington for a while and Missouri and a couple other places in the state. And then I'm back here with my family. I'm a single mom of 5. My kids are between ages of 8 and 20. And we have 2 dogs who are mother and daughter, and they keep us busy. Yeah.
Sounds like we got some dog families here too. I've only got a parent of a dog myself. That's it. So much to my parents' chagrin. So All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So I do want to hear about Amy's personal story related to domestic violence. But first, I want to hear a little bit more about where you work, Allie, at Shelter House and the role it plays in supporting victims of domestic violence. So can you talk a little bit about what Shelter House does and what's your role at Shelter House?
Absolutely. Thank you. I always like starting with this because I think that it provides a really good baseline context for our conversation. This is also how I start all of my presentations, with information about my agency. So Shelter House is a nonprofit organization in Midland, Michigan. We also serve Gladwin County. We are a domestic violence sexual assault service agency. So what we do is we provide refuge, hope, and healing to survivors of both domestic and sexual violence. And we do that in a lot of ways, but some of the most notable ones are safe shelter. We have master's level therapy, counseling, we have advocacy, we have court liaisons. We have all sorts of programs to really help survivors get where they need to be on the path to healing. My role in particular is that of prevention and outreach coordinator. A large majority of my position is being in the community, whether that is, doing presentations to general community members about the issues of domestic and sexual violence, or in the schools with kiddos doing prevention programming, because, I fully believe that domestic and sexual violence can be prevented. These are issues that we do not have to live with in our society, and there are ways that we can prevent it. So my job is fun. It's out in the community. I get to talk to people, which is a great role for myself. So yeah, I think that sums it up about Shelter House.
Awesome. And I want to come back later to hear more about your ideas about, I know that you're a preventionist and believe that's preventable. So I would love to hear some more thoughts on how we can tangibly do that.
Absolutely.
But Amy, I want to pass it off to you. Can you tell us your story?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely why we're here today, to explore all this. So it's interesting with this kind of a story, where does it actually begin? It's such a great question, because my most recent experience with domestic violence was not my first. So when the question is asked, what's your experience with it? I know that there's a trail that kind of goes way, way back into different experiences that I had when I was young, when I was a teenager and a young woman. And the most recent experience was with my second husband. My first marriage, I had 3 beautiful children. And unfortunately, that relationship did end with some altercations related to domestic violence. And that was what helped me realize, okay, we cannot be together anymore. So I was really set on changing that and looking at that, but I didn't fully have the resources I needed at the time. And I don't even think I had the awareness on how to identify the red flags and do something different with them than I had done before. Because I have a big heart, I can see the good in someone, and then being able to relate to that part of them that is struggling or, can harm has been tricky for me. So with my second husband, we met, he was living in a different state, and we connected right away. There were a lot of commonalities in our spiritual beliefs and dreams that we held together. And he had some experience with children, but didn't have children of his own. And we actually moved to the area where he lived, really appreciated his parents, but it was a pretty isolated area, very rural. And this is the point where I feel like I can look back and go, there was a red flag. It wasn't that it was him, it was just the situation at hand. Like, here I am going where I have very little support. We didn't have a long span of getting to know each other. It was a little less than a year. And he had shared with me, that he had struggled with anger as a teenager. Well, so did I. There had been a couple things that were there that let me know that he was working through some things, but I had no idea where it was going to end up going. And so after about 6-8 months, some rages started, and it was a matter of and I was by that point, after I had moved down there, I was pregnant, we were getting married, I had the 3 younger children the youngest was 3, the oldest was 8. And the rage started, rage that felt like it came from me out of nowhere. There were holes in the walls, just seething communication, a lot of intimidation. Whether or not he wasn't trying to be intimidating, it was definitely intimidating for me and for us. A lot of fear, a lot of just, I'm not sure what to do with this. Really, it was right. Paralyzing, honestly, at the time. And then there was, partially because we hadn't known each other, real long. It was less than 2 years. And the context was that, the support I had was his family, who was actually very, very supportive. I was grateful for that. We were still learning each other as a couple. So there really wasn't, enough time and space for me to have understood this about him and for him to understand that about himself. And so these rages came, and as they started happening more frequently, because the first couple of times it's like, okay, is he just overwhelmed? He's got new responsibilities and new people he's dealing with. And like, what is this all about? And then started saying, like, this isn't stopping. This is getting worse. It's taking longer. It felt like it was taking longer for the recovery period where like, here's this explosion. And then it's maybe 24 hours. No, it's 3 days. No, it's a week. No, he doesn't want any communication. There was a lot of withdrawal on the other end of that where we were waiting for him to kind of come back around. Because in that situation, he was able to come back around to be very connected and playful. And I think sometimes people look at, these abusive situations such that it's just all one way, or you can just put it in a box and it's going to fit. And it doesn't always do that. And there's probably some sort of positive redeeming qualities of the person, or you just wouldn't stay. And during that time, I remember one time making a phone call to my mom and saying, I just don't know if I can stay here. And I wouldn't tell her why. And when they came to visit, and I guess I feel a little embarrassed, but it's just the truth. When they came to visit, I had put inspirational posters and nature posters over the holes in the walls because they couldn't all be repaired. He had repaired some, but not all of them. And sometimes these holes would be pretty close to our person where they were made. And so during that time, I had the number of a domestic violence shelter in my pocket. And when he would have a rage and these things would happen, I would tell the kids, like, he would go outside after it was done. We lived in a very pretty natural area. And I would tell the kids, like, pack up whatever you need right now. We're going to go for a drive. And I would have it in the back of my mind that, like, I could go there. But this particular shelter was 20 miles, like, the opposite direction of Michigan. And I thought, if I go there, he'll find us and he'll kill us. And it's like the other way. And I don't know how I'm going to get home where my family is. And sometimes we would go to his parents and sit there. I would feel a little bit safer there. We had some friends that we kind of connected with that we tried to work through some things with. And he would say, which is quite common, and I do believe that he meant it, he didn't want to hurt us. And eventually, I never went to the shelter in Missouri. I thought about it probably over 100 times. And we eventually ended up moving back up here to Michigan. And we came here, moved into, stayed with my parents for a little bit, moved into the house that we're in now. And we kind of thought we would have a new beginning here. We also knew of a therapist nearby that we could both work with. It was not brought to my attention, though, that it's not advisable for people who are experiencing domestic violence to have counseling together.
Interesting.
And there's lots of good reasons why that is, because the ownership has to be taken by the person who is violating the other person or people on their own, because there's something in that for them. There's stuff underneath that. And then the person who's experiencing the violation, needs to be able to really have their story understood and heard, where it's not complicated by them going on top of each other. So we tried some of that and it wasn't successful. There were sessions that we had where he would leave, and I left and went to the shelter house around Christmas of 2012. And I went for 3 days. He agreed to leave the state. I went back to the house. We stayed separated for almost a year while he went to some counseling and stuff. And then he came back and I let him back in. And it wasn't very long, a month or two, before it started again. Doors broken into 50 pieces, rages that I just like, wait a minute. It just kind of went from like one thing to like all the way. It's just a totally different situation now. And everybody in the house is afraid. And so at a certain point, it got to where I was really concerned that there would be I wouldn't be here anymore. And it was that night where there was an explosion that erupted at me and my son. And I watched as I felt paralyzed to do anything, even though my mouth was saying, stop. I couldn't do anything with my body. And I was experiencing like a startle effect. You see a baby, you put it and they go like this, like that was happening when somebody would walk in the room. And I realized, okay, I have been trying to be patient with this in a way. I've also been really scared that if we go, he'll do something drastic. And I really realized that I'm still afraid he's going to kill us if we leave. And I don't want to take that risk if I'm here. And I just try and make everything be as whatever as it can be. If I just be supportive, if I just show up as this kind of a wife. And yet I had this conflict of this is really messed up and I don't want to be experiencing this. And it's impacting my children. And, I'm an advocate for children. And this is scary. And I had friends that I talked to that they kind of pulled back because they're like, why are you still there? Why is he still there? Why is this happening? And so that night, my older kids and I stayed up that whole night. We could not sleep. It wasn't a matter of like, we didn't sleep. We could not sleep because of the fear was in our bodies. And I called Shelter House and I was like, all right, we gotta go. Like, we have to take the risk of him doing something because this is no way to live. Like, we are literally dying in this environment. So I called the Shelter House, and bless their hearts, they had, they made room for us. We were at first in a playroom that they just makeshifted for us to sleep in that night. Me and my 5 kids. I mean, they were little. The littlest one was 2 or 3. And then they made a room up for us that had like 3 beds. And one of the crazy things that was happening during this time was I was facilitating a meditation challenge with parents online during this time. And I was recording the meditations in the closet at the Shelter House
Oh my
for these
gosh.
other parents, and myself, because honestly, I needed it just as much as they did. But like in the closet, just like trying to continue this 40-day challenge that I had set up to support people. It was very ironic that here I was going through this, but we stayed for 3 weeks, and the Shelter House gave me that safety. I feel like I felt more safe there than I ever had in my whole life, because I'd had such a contrast to what it felt like to not be safe for so long. And he left, and I got a protection order because while I was there, we talked on the phone. He wanted me to talk to him. And I was really glad that I had went to the Shelter House, because he came to the house without permission. He was in the house damaging stuff and told me that, he wanted to choke me and lit the house on fire. And if I would hang up, that the house would be on fire. In that moment, I was like, okay, do I hang up and call the police and the fire department, or do I stay on the phone and try and talk him down? So I did choose to just stay on the phone. Thankfully, he didn't light the house on fire. He did about $800 with the damage and the destruction that he was doing while we were talking. But I did get off the phone, call the police department. They said, definitely do a personal protection order. I did it. And when I told him about it, because you have to either deliver it to them by hand or it's got to get to that person somehow. He was in shock. It still had not clicked for him entirely, the impact of his actions. And to this day, which I'll share more as we get into this, was like, that was a turning point for him. He may be the anomaly, but for him to recognize what was going on and like how much it was impacting his family. And so he left, and we have been separated since like May of 2015.
It's so many things struck me throughout your story, and thank you so much for sharing. It's the amount of courage that you show to support others while is in the closet of Shelter House to continue to be a support for others, and yet going through these ordeals. The courage you had to show is just incredible, and also the fact that he wasn't cognizant of the impact until really those letters were handed to him. Just such a disconnect to me that it baffles me. So can you just continue just a little bit more? Can you tell me what was going through your head when in the midst of this, when you're trying to make sense of what was happening? Can you maybe your thought processes? Can you talk me through just a little bit more on that?
I come to partnership with a pretty serious heart, a very committed person, a loyal person. So in the beginning, but also wanting to keep my head on my shoulders in terms of like what's needed for the family. In the beginning, it was like, is this something that can be worked through? Is this something he can change and grow with? Does he want to? What kind of help is available for someone who's dealing with this? And will he engage with it to the point where it can actually be changed and that he can heal from whatever is underneath this? And then there was definitely some self-blame, which was not warranted. I never, ever did anything to deserve it. Neither did my kids. And I didn't really feel like we deserved it. I just kind of felt this sense of like, well, I got myself into this. Like, how am I going to show up as a partner now to him while he's dealing with this? And we have kids, and because we did have 2 kids together. And then it became just a mix of love and fear all the time. It was like, okay. And I do share in an article that I wrote, there was this one time when he got right in my face and like pressed his forehead against mine and, told me how good it would feel to rip my head off bloody. And it was like, I'm completely scared of you, but I also feel that I love you in the same moment. I think it's interesting. People talk about you can't have love and fear in the same moment. Well, I did. I actually did in that moment. I felt both, but I also like the logical, like protective part of me was like, okay, this can't continue. We need some space. This is not healthy. I knew it wasn't healthy. And that's a horrible place to be, especially, we did have kids. What would happen to the kids? We potentially get, custody and they'd be unsafe. Where would he be? There was some concern I was concerned about his mental health in terms of just, would he choose to take a rash action and hurt himself or something? There was a lot going on in my mind. And then there was also the just overall security of the family and still wanting the family to be healthy and whole as one. And just this constant processing of like, is that feasible? Well, not right now. It's not. What steps do I, okay, here's the other piece. What steps do I need to take to get strong enough to be on my own and get out of this? And then also be able to be in whatever kind of relationship he and I can have for the children. I think that we both went through some things together spiritually that bonded us together. And we didn't have a lot of support to talk about those things with other people in the same ways. And that's always, when you have some sort of bonding in specific areas of your life that are tender for you, that can go a couple different ways. But that was definitely underneath that for us too.
I can only imagine all of the multitude of things that were going through your mind and trying to rationalize this with that throughout it. Allie, I'm going to turn to you a little bit, and Amy, please feel free to chime in at any moment. But what is the best ways to get help in these situations, and also what planning can be done in advance as well?
And I want to say, Amy, thank you for sharing your story. Every time a survivor tells their story, it takes courage. It takes a level of healing, and healing we know is not linear. And so I thank you for sharing that. Now, when I think about what the best ways to get help are, if somebody is in an abusive relationship, the one thing that I want to make very clear is that the person that knows that answer the best is the survivor themselves. It is a very complicated as Amy showed us when you asked what was going through her mind, there was everything from love to extreme fear happening in her brain. And there was these waves in between, right? And so the other thing to note that safety-wise, nobody knows an abuser better than a survivor, than their partner. And so, when we're talking about what's the best way to get help in this situation, the best way, honestly, is the safest way. And so there are resources, I will always advocate for survivors to seek and reach out to agencies like Shelter House, of which there are many. If you Google them in your area, there is sure to be one close to you. And if there's not, there's national hotlines to help. So I always encourage reaching out to agencies like ours. And the reason for that is because we are the experts. We do know the ins and outs of domestic violence. So for example, Amy mentioned that at some point she was misled to believe that a viable or a healthy course to navigate this abusive situation was to seek couples counseling. And that is something that an agency like ours would not recommend. And so that is why I always say, call a hotline, call an agency, because we know that we know what can help and what might actually make things worse. And so, that's my biggest thing. The best way to get help is to reach out and to keep yourself safe. That's always what I'm going to say. As far as planning that can be done in advance, it can be planned in advance. This is called safety planning. This is something that's used with domestic violence advocates all over the country, all over the world. Again, safety planning is something that can be done at an agency like ours before a survivor decides to leave. So that's important to note too, that these agencies aren't just for people who have just left. If you are still in a home and you are still experiencing abuse, but you want to try to seek a way out, advocates at agencies like ours can help that. So it's a very individualized process. Advocates can help at agencies like ours. There's also help on the internet. If you happen to live in an area, like Amy said, where it was the closest agency was 20 miles away and it wasn't feasible for her to get there, or it wasn't going to be healthy or safe to get there. The internet has a lot of really great options. So safety planning is definitely one of those things. But to wrap it up, I want everybody to know that we're talking about leaving an abusive relationship. The person that lives it knows it best. And we as support people, as loved ones, as a community, we need to trust that. Because if they're not ready, we can't force them, right? We can support, we can uplift, we can reach our hands out, but forcing somebody out of that situation can be more harmful than it can be good.
Interesting. Amy, I know that you and I in our previous conversations have talked about how important safety planning was to you too. Can you speak to that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. When we went in 2012, I started to really look into what would it take for us to just create the safety that I actually feel in Shelter House right now in my own house. And I started to look into it. And for me, it was just being really honest about the particulars of the situation. How bad is it? How bad could it get? What are my resources that I have in friends, family, in my community that I can reach out to? Who can I talk to? Do I have a go bag ready that I could actually take? What's blocking me from that? relationships and domestic violence and that. And a lot of them are just like, why didn't she leave? Like it's just this black and white thing. And what Allie highlighted so well is that it's not. There's a lot of different things to consider. And so the safety planning can just help us see that we have options, because also most likely a person in that situation is not going to feel super powerful or super like they have a lot of choices available to them. So it just starts to exercise that muscle in us of, I can make choices. I do have help. There are people who care, and just think through those things so that you can actually, go when you're ready, if that's what you need to do.
So this idea of why didn't you just leave? I'd like you both to speak to, what are some of these preconceived ideas or notions that people have about domestic violence? Like, why didn't you just leave? What are some of these preconceived ideas or notions that people have that may be inaccurate?
Well, I can, coming at it from, I really appreciate working with Amy in this space, because I think that a survivor's testimony is one of the most powerful tools in educating about domestic violence. And so I absolutely want to hear what she'll say. And so I'll just add, what I know from a generalized perspective. The biggest misconception about domestic violence, I think, when we think of it in this context, is that why won't they just leave? And you know what? It's interesting too, that when we talk about even the misconceptions, we use the words, why didn't she just leave? There are plenty of myths and misconceptions that we can break down about domestic violence here. And one of that being, implying that somebody can just leave implies privilege, right? It implies a lot of things, a healthy mindset privilege. It implies financial, social privilege. It implies that the person who is being victimized understands fully what's happening. But the reality of it is that domestic violence is very complicated. It is like a system of victimization within a relationship. And so to simplify it in such a way where we ask, well, if he hit you or if she hit you, why didn't you just walk out the door? Well, think about the kids that are behind her that need to walk out that door too. Think about the money that perpetrator has hidden away every paycheck that victim doesn't have access to. Think about the lack of support system that perpetrator has isolated from their partner, right? And so that's one big misconception. And I mentioned it on She. This is a whole different topic. I don't know if we'll touch on this later, but anybody can be victimized by domestic violence. Literally anybody. And I heard that in Amy's story. I found it interesting. I always like to point out when this happens, because we have in our society such a picture of a domestic violence victim. And that picture comes from the roots of the domestic violence movement, which were for privileged middle-class white women, right? So that's what we see when we think about domestic violence. That's where this field really started. But men are victimized. Women of color are victimized. Individuals that are non-binary are victimized. Transgender are victimized. Sexual orientations all across the board are victimized. Those without documentation in the United States are victimized. And so by limiting ourselves to this very, very small image of a woman, and most likely a white woman, we are missing so many survivors in this conversation. So that's a big misconception. And I want anybody out there that's hearing this and who may not identify as a white woman, that if this has happened to you, you are heard, your experience is valid, and people will help you. I promise that.
Thank you for that, Allie. Thank you so much. Amy, what are your thoughts on other preconceived ideas or notions people may have?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so grateful that Allie, you spoke to all of that. And my experience obviously is my own, and I hope to share it in a way that will help people connect with a deeper well of compassion for anybody who experiences it, because I'm really speaking to it from the survival perspective that it brings up for, I think, anybody, even if it's physical abuse or physical intimidation, it's mental or emotional. It can be when something brings us to the brink of our own safety and survival. It can do a lot of different things in our psyche and our experience. But what I'd like to do for just a moment is just invite anybody who's listening to consider, if you were faced with the possibility of needing to, at a moment's notice, take yourself to a homeless shelter. And just imagine that you have pets or you have kids. Set aside all the conversation you've just heard and just contemplate that for a moment and what that would feel like for you. What kinds of things you'd need to think through, what kinds of emotions would arise. So that question, why didn't they leave? If you consider that, what's going to happen next is probably you'll think of like, but wait, there's this violence, there's this, there's this, that. That actually, it doesn't simplify it, it complicates it, because then you have this other layer of, like you said, what about the money? What about the stability? What about the relationship? What about the danger? I haven't looked at the recent statistic, but it was like a 70 times greater incidence of death upon leaving a relationship when there's violence involved. It's very real that's when it heightens. Like my first marriage, when I was seeking change and divorce and there was altercations, like I was choked. That was the last step. That's how that ended for me. So it's real. That fear and that danger is real. And then even if that isn't the level of danger that the person feels like they're experiencing, there are just all these other factors that have to be thought through. And when you hit on that healthy mindset as a privilege, that's real too. Because how do we get into these situations and how do they last as long as they do? On some level, we can't see a way out of it, and or we don't feel like we deserve any different. And the shame that society puts on people for their circumstances doesn't really help.
Absolutely. So kind of touching on that too, is you got to that point, but oftentimes when we think about domestic violence, we're thinking about physical abuse, but how often is it just verbal or psychological abuse? And is that more difficult to leave? I mean, it's maybe at least he doesn't hit me mentality.
Right. We do have that perception because, and honestly, that perception or that image of what domestic violence is, it had a place in history because domestic violence for so long was not addressed publicly, period. Full stop, wasn't talked about, right? And so it has that physical aspect of it that we now are so, I don't want to say comfortable with as the idea of domestic violence, but that's what we know. It had its purpose, right? And that was to make violence, this domestic violence, seem bad. That's black and white. People know hitting other people is a bad thing. And so this physical violence is really what started an awareness of what was going on in so many homes across the world. But it's not the only version of abuse, right? You've mentioned verbal and emotional, psychological. You can call it a bunch of different things. Quite honestly, I tend to call it emotional abuse, but it has subcategories, galore. And I don't know of any physically abusive relationships that don't have an element of emotional abuse. Likewise, there are people that are, that walk through our door at Shelter House or seek help elsewhere that have never been physically touched by their partner ever. And so this is another one of those misconceptions that's really important to break down because every form of abuse is valid for survivors. There is no hierarchy of, physical abuse is the worst type of abuse and, verbal abuse is lesser. That's not true. Every single survivor is impacted deeply by the way that they were abused. And it's important that we break down that misconception because otherwise we won't be able to have empathy. We won't be able to have true help for survivors in our community.
Yeah, thank you. I want to touch on the idea of gaslighting, this concept. And so gaslighting really happens a lot more than people realize in smaller scales, like at work or at home. But in its most extreme, it's used to control and destabilize someone. So how can we recognize the signs of gaslighting?
Yeah, so gaslighting is a term that has become more known in the last few years, I think. And it's important. I really do think this is an important term that we understand. However, I'm on the TikTok, as my husband calls it, the TikTok. And I see this phrase being thrown around casually, just like I see, the word rape thrown around casually, stalk, Facebook stalk casually. So I think that I just want to mention that I think there's a danger of us overusing it. And I think that's something we should watch out for. However, gaslighting itself is a very crucial thing to understand when we're talking about abusive relationships. It's a tactic that's used by many people in many different sectors, whether it's in relationships or at work or in parenting, all sorts of different things. And essentially what it is, its goal is to maintain power and control over somebody, right? And they do this by making somebody question their reality. And so it's often done slowly. Just like an abusive relationship doesn't start off abusive on date one, gaslighting happens slowly as well, to the point where when it comes to a head, somebody that individual that's been gaslit doesn't know what's up and what's down, what's right and what's wrong, what is actually happening, what reality really is. And it can be very, very hard to unpack. So some of the signs of gaslighting are, blatant lying, denying saying or doing things that clearly were done or that you have, proof of somebody doing, using things that you love to tear you down. For example, children or your work, right? Saying, I'm going to tell them that you did this thing that you never did, using words that don't match their actions and quite frankly, telling somebody and telling everybody around them that they're crazy, right? So it's this idea that your reality is not reality. My reality is our reality.
Interesting. And I can see how it could be overarching, but it's such an important concept for people to be aware of. So thank you for sharing, Allie. Amy, can we talk a little bit more about your past partner and maybe talk a little bit about his experiences, both in the past and now that you're no longer together? And maybe, I know in previous conversations, we've talked a little about the role that trauma plays in perpetuating abuse as well. So if you can maybe talk a little bit more about your past partner and his experiences, both in the past and now that he's a little more cognizant of his actions and what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, he did share some things with me early on, and then it became apparent how that was affecting him as the relationship progressed. And, his upbringing he had 2 caring parents, but a bunch of brothers and a lot of rough. And he experienced some abuse at the hands of people outside of his family that had been largely suppressed and did not come up until we were in partnership. And as these things were explored more, it became clear how, they had just developed into patterns within him that they somewhat seemed just part of the way people conduct themselves, or this is how, men express their anger. And so even though he was able to sometimes listen to me and hear me about how that was impacting us and maybe change in the short term or for a while, it would come back up because it was just there under the surface. And it took a while for him to really see and decide to work on changing the stuff that was underneath it for him. So, like I said, initially we tried some counseling together, and that did not get us where we needed to be. And it wasn't consistent and effective enough at the time. There was probably some help at sometimes with that. But then when we separated over time, when I just kept focusing on, I care about you, I care about family, I care about kids, I care about me, and we need safety, and that's it. And I know this relationship means a lot to us, and we just need safety. However, safety is going to happen. Like I felt like when I left, it was like putting a stake in the ground. Safety is what we're going to have. And so he started to orient himself to all the places and ways in himself that he wasn't being safe. And he decided after a while to get some counseling to start to unpack the trauma that he'd experienced, to be able to work through that and be able to, someday be able to see his children in person again, because we live in different states. They do see him over video. We've been able to do some mediation such that we have a working relationship, co-parenting, and they're able to be friends. But there are still those scary places that we're actually looking at, what is that process to be able to get it where you can actually be in the same physical location with the children safely. And there's like underground, I don't know if Shelter House has this, but Underground Railroad has a safe place where parents can meet up with the kids, there's supervision, and then you can do that kind of a visitation. But like the pacing, I don't want to judge his pacing. It took a while, and it took, I think, for him to know how to do it on his terms. And some people are not going to like what I'm about to say, but in our situation, this is what the case was. Like, just as much as a person experiencing domestic violence needs to be able to do it on their own terms, that was what his experience was, to be able to, and partially because of the trauma he experienced and how that was, erupting on us, he needed to get it to a point where he could go and seek that help on his own to be able to do that work for himself. And we'll see, over time how that leads. We've been able to, like I say, be able to have a working co-parenting relationship and be able to converse on some issues and feel mutually supportive. But that was because he was willing to leave and willing to create that safety by not coming back and, attacking or anything like that. And so it's really going to be dependent on where that individual is and how willing they are to self-reflect and take in the feedback of their experiences of like, oh my goodness, my partner went to a domestic violence shelter. Oh my, they got a personal protection order. This means something about me. Am I willing to own that and do something with that? And I still feel like there's room in our society for sure with the stigma and the shame to to look at like what is actually available for people who do want that change, like genuinely, because that would be, if I wonder sometimes, and maybe this is the effects of these experiences on my brain, but would more people take that path if they knew there was to work through it and change their behavior? Because I think sometimes for some people who are trapped in that kind of behavior, it's really a trap. They know no way out. They might not be cognizant of it. And if they are, they don't know where to get the help to be able to change it consistently. There's a lot of layers to that kind of a pattern in somebody.
Can we unpack this ideas of stigma a little bit more? I think that I'd like to hear more about what are some stigmas around domestic violence for survivors and how do they affect survivors? But you've also touched upon on your past partner, some stigmas that he maybe are facing. Can we unpack some of these stigmas for survivors and how they affect them, but also maybe elaborate a little bit more about for perpetrators as well? So maybe Allie, do you want to start on this side?
Yeah, I think that Amy's really eloquently been able to explain some of these complicated things that happen with abusive relationships. And so, there are a lot of stigmas. The biggest, that I see, and, we've touched on it, is that it's easy to leave, that it's easy to get out of this relationship, which then implies that individuals are, lazy, or they are willingly staying in something, that they're stupid for staying in a situation that is harmful. And so that kind of has layers to it that person deserves it somehow. And that's just not true. Nobody deserves to be abused. Everybody deserves to have a safe, loving, and healthy relationship. And, with that stigma of being abused, and I'd love to hear more from Amy's experience, because what I've heard is that's something that feeling of when people know I have been an abuse survivor, that follows me and somehow becomes part of my identity, even after leaving. And these are humans with lives. They are mothers, their fathers, their brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. They're people that work in corporate. They're people that have jobs. There's teachers. They're people that have hobbies and have dogs. Like, these are humans that we're talking about with whole lives that then are reduced to an experience that happened to them. And so I think that's something that is worth actively fighting against.
Thank you, Allie. Amy, what are your thoughts on this?
There is a lot to unpack around stigma. And a couple things that come to my mind, right off the top of my head, are like, people question someone's intentions, their intelligence, their ability to make wise decisions. And I get it. It's easy from the outside to have an opinion about somebody else's choices. We never know the full story unless we sit down with that person and we hear that story and we put ourselves in their shoes. So I think the stigma just comes from that like slapstick judgment that anybody who's self-aware can step back from and realize, oh wait, there's more to this. This is not such an easy thing, and I'm actually being judgy by judging. There were times along the way that I was hesitant to share. And sometimes it was from that judgment and stigma that I would receive from people who were close to me, who went with the, why don't you just leave? And I share now, and I own it because I know what brought me to it. I can be compassionate with myself to the choices I made, and see that I did the best that I could under the circumstances. And that I think the biggest part for me is like, people can change, people can learn, people can grow. And so our stories are part of us, but they're also chapters that we can literally move on from and write from there. So I feel like conversations like this and people just kind of opening their hearts and minds to those judgments that we're handed or that society kind of holds out in the air are just judgments. They're not the truth. They don't really know. You can't make that decision unless you were in those exact same circumstances with that exact same mindset, that exact same history. And when you look at the brain science around what happens when we feel unsafe and feeling paralyzed and feeling like, the confusion that can be there. And then if you do have gaslighting or something in there, it's just not that easy. And as far as for, perpetrators, that's just a whole nother thing on stigma. I wished when we were in the middle of it, I wish there were more resources, because he claimed at the time, and I do believe that he really wanted to do something different. And we looked into programs. There are some, and there are some effectiveness. in terms of like their longer term. They're like a year, I think 6 months to a year, which is needed minimum probably, because it can be almost, and I'm not saying this is the case for everybody, but it can almost be, an addiction, a very well-worn pattern in somebody. For this is just, it's a very reactive. There is no space between whatever is setting them off and their reaction. And then, depending on the person, there could be more to that story that they're perpetuating and kind of feeding it for themselves. So I feel like at least if we would hold open the space that some people do want to change, and those people ought to be offered some support, and that possibly as conversations are broadened around just trauma in general, and that our patterns from our childhood can be replayed until they're really met and like revealed and healed, that, perpetrators deserve some support to stop those patterns, because we can leave and we can create some safety that way. But what would be even better in addition is, can we get those people some help so they don't do that anymore? Maybe not in that partnership, maybe that partnership is done, but for the next one and for their own well-being, right. Because I feel like people can be kind of tormented with that in their systems. It wasn't like he was enjoying that.
Well, thank you for sharing, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
So as we close out our time today, can you both give some advice to our listeners, whether they know somebody who is in a domestic violence situation? How would you support someone who is in that situation? Or maybe if they're starting to fall in love with someone, what are some advice for them, for those people going into those relationships? Because as we've talked about today, you don't know until you start to do things, move quickly, and kids come into play, and your lives become intertwined. So what would be advice for some listeners, either they're falling in love or if they know someone who's in these situations?
Well, my advice always centers around education. I think that is the most crucial tool that we have at our disposal to bring awareness to domestic violence. This conversation, this topic, it matters to each and every person that is listening to this podcast. It does matter. Whether or not you think that it matters, maybe you haven't thought about domestic violence in your own life, or you haven't explored what it is. You've heard it now, and it's on you to figure out how this matters to you. Is it because you've been victimized? Is it because you know a victim? Is it because you have never thought about this before and you want to learn more and you need to be educated? Is it because you've had prejudice against victims in the past because you've held some of these misconceptions that society has put into our brains? It does matter. And I know that it matters because we live in a society where domestic and sexual violence still occur, despite the fact that these are issues that are totally preventable. And so this signals to me that all of us, that there is work to do on an individual level, there's work to do on community levels, and there's work to do on a societal level. So my advice is to think, to educate, learn about red flags, learn about behaviors, learn about the ins and outs of this issue. And quite honestly, it's not going to take, there are resources out there. There's websites that tell you everything that you would need to know in a snapshot. It's not going to take you years to become an expert, but it is important. And for us to have a safe and healthy community, we need to have conversations like this. People need to do work on an individual level, and we need to best support our neighbors who are going through things like this.
Thank you. And Amy, what are some advice you would have for listeners listening to this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to address the people who might have a friend or they might come across someone who is in a domestic violence situation or some sort of abusive situation. The first and foremost, I feel like what people really need is listening. They need people who will just be there and show support in a non-judgmental way. And, we have to know our own boundaries of how much we can or cannot get involved. But when I was in that situation, knowing the people I could go to and talk to, they knew my heart. They knew that I wanted better for my family. And that made a world of difference to know there was support there, that I could go and talk and know the support resources that are available in your community. Figure out, what are the shelters? Would you like me to make a call with you? Would you like me to safety plan with you? How are you, how safe are you feeling today? Do you feel like you're in danger today? Is there anything we could do to support you today? And just remember that, your presence in their life matters. If they're talking to you about it, they want it to be different too. So do what you can to be there for them within your own boundaries, along with, educating in that, like Ali said. And for the young people or people just falling in love, or maybe it's someone who's been in a situation before and you're finding yourself kind of broken, allow yourself to really learn what you want and you need and to trust yourself again. Like that's where the foundation is going to be. And then take your time. I'm working with a teacher friend who says, it takes about 3 months for someone's mask to come off and another 3 months for their shadow to show itself. So it's like 6 months. And during that time, you can pay attention to those red flags and notice like, oh, I'm still driven to connect with this person. But wait a second, there's this here. What can I do to keep this relationship in a healthier place for me, or move on? Just not be in this relationship anymore. And there's a lot in between all of that. It's not as easy as that. But at the same time, if you can keep yourself and your needs and rebuilding your trust with yourself, it will yield a different experience in relationship. And you deserve that, to trust yourself, to be able to feel safe. You really do.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for being here today and sharing such a personal story to all of our listeners. And Allie, thank you for being here to share your expertise. It's been so valuable to have you both on today. And I just want to say thank you for being here.
Thank you for having
Absolutely.
us.
Thank you.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.